The Book of Revelation, a series of Bible studies for Bible study groups with Beecroft Pennant Hills Uniting Church. Well, hello. It's John here from the island of Patmos. You can see the lovely island behind me, but no, of course, it's not real. That's an image that's in my background, and I'm sharing you an image of the island of Patmos because we're going to start a series of studies on the book of Revelation, which we're told in the book of Revelation was written by John on the island of Patmos. Now, this is the first session of a number, and I'm not too sure how many at this point, but hopefully, it will be a way of delving into the very complex book of Revelation. There has been many attempts over the centuries of trying to understand Revelation, and it has been, derided by very famous theologians over the centuries as being non-Christian or being very difficult to understand, at least. And of course, it's been used and abused for a variety of purposes that, it certainly wasn't intended for. So we're going to try over these few Bible studies to cut through some of the myths and the fallacies around the book of Revelation. I'm not going to talk for long. Most of the studies will be in the form of text in a PowerPoint presentation that this video is part of. So there will be a number of slides. This first is an introduction, and we'll cover the 5 W's of Revelation. The 5 W's being the who, what, when, where, and why. And hopefully that's enough to get us started. You can read the book of Revelation in its entirety if you wish as a starting point, but don't feel you have to. If you do read it in its entirety or even in sections, perhaps you'll note down some things that you find particularly interesting or confusing, or, although much of it is confusing. So I guess I want to start with an anecdote, and that is one I've gleaned from somebody by the name of Mark Davis, who's a Presbyterian minister in the US, who tells of his days in seminary when he was sitting in a class that was going to look at Revelation, and the lecturer wandered in the first 5 minutes of the lecture, wandered through the class, walking up and down the aisles of the desks and the students, saying these few words: Revelation, not revelations, and repeating them over and over again: Revelation, not revelations. It was enough to drive Mark Davis crazy, mad. He got angry, and he really wondered what he was supposed to learn out of this, apart from the fact that it's called the Book of Revelation, not the Book of Revelations, which is a common mistake that people made. I think in my youth, I probably made that same mistake. It is the Book of Revelation, and we're going to learn why it's called the Book of Revelation, even though to our ears and eyes, it really doesn't reveal all that much. It is a very obscure book indeed. And apart from the purpose of getting the name right, that it is a singular revelation rather than plural, the sense is that Well, yes, it is about one revelation. It is of a whole, and it shouldn't be cut up too much into what we might imagine are a series or a range of different revelations. So, with that little anecdote and lesson, let's head into looking at the 5 W's: the who, what, why, when, and where of Revelation. Hope you enjoy. Okay, so our first W is the who. The book of Revelation identifies the recipient of this vision as John. And it mentions that at least 5 times in the book of Revelation, 3 of which come in the first chapter. Now, it's unwise to assume that this writer John is actually the same person as the Apostle John, or the writer of the 4th Gospel we know as John's Gospel, or even the writer of the letters called 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. There's no indication that there's any connection between any of those authors. Who the John is that writes the book of Revelation is not and never has been a settled question. It's the answer to that question lies in the dim, distant past. But most modern scholars do not attribute it, the book of Revelation, to the author of the 4th Gospel. So we have to ask, well, who was John? And was John in prison, or at least in exile in Patmos? Well, it's fairly unlikely. Despite verse 4 saying he was there because of persecution, there's actually no historical evidence of the early church being persecuted at the time John was writing. And Patmos was never a Roman penal settlement. Rather, John was likely a passionate missionary, well known in Asia Minor and the churches that he addresses in that area. And he was taking some time out on the island of Patmos to write. And from his knowledge of Hebrew scripture, John was likely a Jewish Christian, though he was writing in Greek, which was his second language. So if we have a sense of who wrote it, we've probably got a better sense of to whom it was written, because Revelation 1 verse 4 specifically addresses it to the 7 churches that are in Asia, and they're spelled out for us in verse 11 of chapter 1. And you can read those 7 churches there. Biblical scholars refer to this area as Asia Minor, most of which we call the Republic of Turkey today. But as we'll see, that 7 churches are named is probably symbolic, because the number 7 was symbolic of wholeness or completeness. So the fact that it was 7 churches implies that it was actually referring to all churches. The fact that it's addressed to churches doesn't clarify exactly who are the recipients of the letter, because Revelation is addressed to the 7 ecclesia that in Asia. Now, the word translated as church didn't mean what it does today. The Greek ecclesia literally means called out, and referred to a group, a meeting or assembly of people who exercise leadership or governance at a local level, a bit like local government does today, but only a bit like local government does today. The word church actually comes from a different Greek word, kyriakon, which means of the Lord. So ecclesia, it says in verse 6 of chapter 1, ecclesia are to be kings and priests serving God. So there's a sense that because it mentions both kings and priests, that ecclesia are about both political and religious service to God. So now we get on to the what of Revelation. What is this book called Revelation? Well, the word revelation comes from the first word of the first verse of chapter 1. We know as apocalypse, or in Greek it is apocalypsis, and literally it means unveiling or revealing, hence the word revelation, which, is a little ironic, you might think, since it is couched in so much mystery and symbolism. Theologian James Allison says of apocalypse that passages which employ this violent language make use of a literary genre that was widespread in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Jesus and is called by its students the apocalyptic genre. Normally there is a heavenly vision mediated by angels, and the end of this world is promised, along with a consolation of the just, among other things. Theologian and biblical scholar Francis Maloney has this to say about Revelation. The puzzling symbols and violent narrative sequences of apocalyptic literature indicate a God who transcends the human story. And John, in Revelation, makes copious use of such symbols and narrative sequences, but he uses them in his own unique fashion. We find ourselves, in fact, outside the world in which apocalyptic language was current. So Maloney suggests that it's a Christian message in an apocalyptic dress. But aside from being an apocalypse, that is an unveiling, Revelation also contains other kinds of writing, namely prophecy and letters. Prophecy is not a prediction of the future, but rather a comment on current realities and an exhortation to take action, or perhaps a warning of consequences if action is not taken. So as a prophecy, Revelation exposes Rome and its ways of operating, and warns the seven churches that are living under Rome's pressure about collaborating too closely with Rome. And as far as letters go, well, typical of letters, Revelation begins with addressing those to whom it is written and ends with a blessing. And the significance of this is that it too was a recognized genre and would have been received accordingly. When did all this happen? Well, the traditional dating of the book of Revelation is toward the end of the reign of Emperor Domitian, which would be around the mid-90s of the Common Era, so the first century, towards the end of the first century. The reason for this dating was originally an inaccurate backward projection of persecution of Christians that was thought to be at the hands of Domitian, but in fact happened later, from about 110 in the Common Era, so just the early years of the 2nd century. Nonetheless, the best educated guess is that Revelation was written about 96 in the Common Era. And I can't find anything that contradicts that, despite the findings of the most recent scholarship about the lack of persecution at that time. Other aspects of time that we can consider when reading the book of Revelation, because time was a slipperier concept in ancient cultures than it is for us who think of it almost entirely as a linear concept. But key words relating to non-linear concepts of time in the book of Revelation are kairos, which refers to a kind of a season of time, not in the sense of spring, winter, summer and fall, but more about the right time or the opportune time. The time has come. And kairos is used in contrast to the other word that is used for time, which is chronos. Chronos is about a measured time, really in the sense that we know and understand time, chronos. So we have chronos pieces on our wrists to tell us the time. The other word that is perhaps a bit slippery for us relating to time is tachos, which means quickly, not soon, which it is most commonly translated as. Now, we're familiar with tachos in our word tachometer, which measures the speed of an engine's revolutions, for example. And we might say an engine is revving quickly, tachos, but not soon. So when you see the word soon, or something is going to happen soon, it's actually more accurate to think of it as happening quickly when we're reading Revelation. W is where. Where was John when he wrote the book of Revelation? Well, the easy answer to where is on the island of Patmos, which is what it says in verse 9 of chapter 1. But there are probably secondary questions like, well, was he on Patmos when he had the vision, or did he just write Revelation there? And verse 9 actually says he was in Patmos, which may mean that he had the vision on Patmos and wrote the letter somewhere else. And then there's the question of what John means by in the Spirit, which is a phrase he uses 4 times. Where is that? It's probably more a phenomenological question than a geographical one, though. The last W is why. Why write this obscure book called Revelation? Well, a simple answer, again, is because John had the vision, and in the vision, Jesus told him to write it. That's mentioned in verse 11 and 19 in the first chapter. But that simple answer ignores the fact that the literary genre of apocalyptic is actually couched in terms of visions and commands from God. That is, when John writes the words, he had a vision, did he really have a vision, or is that just part of apocalyptic style? It is far more likely the latter, because the apocalyptic style demands that the message is couched in terms of visions, etc. And without stating that it was a vision, it wouldn't have credibility. So if it's not an actual vision, but rather writing in the style of a vision, what really did motivate John to write it? Well, if John was connected with the churches, as has been suggested, the historical context and the issues the churches were facing, both internally and externally, would have been a motivating factor. The realities that the churches are facing, which John describes, however symbolically, certainly did exist at the time and were a real concern for the future of the churches. But there's also another reason why John wrote it. The fact that there is a lot more to the book of Revelation than the warnings to the 7 churches, which is over and done by the end of chapter 3, the fact that there is so much more should tell us that there was a lot more that John was wanting to convey than just those warnings to the 7 churches. Suffice to say that John was communicating the meaning and significance of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We'll have a lot more to say about that as we get through the later chapters of Revelation. Basically, he chose the medium of apocalypse because it was a common means of communication, but he in fact subverts the usual apocalyptic trope in order to highlight the uniqueness of Jesus. And yep, we'll explore this more later. The end of the introductory 5 W's. They are just the beginning of pointing out exactly what this book is that we'll encounter as we read through it in future sessions. I'll leave you with the 4 reflection questions that you can take your own time with to discuss in your group or think about on your own. Hope you found it useful. Thank you.